Okay, so it's recording right now. So thanks again for coming. And I know it's almost the final of the year, and things are going fast. It would have been amazing to be there, but unfortunately, I had to come back. Some of you may know that my wife is pregnant, and we're having a little girl next week. Um, so yeah, I definitely had to be here, and I was there 2 months ago, which was awesome. Yeah, the overarching title of my thesis, which by the way is a thesis by compilation. So what I'm going to present is a series of papers, a total of 5 papers in different topics that has to that combine the whole thesis. The overall title is The Treasure of the Commons, sort of simulating the tragedy of the commons, but more in a positive way. And this is how we value and manage natural capital in Costa Rica specifically. So I'm gonna stop sharing my video so we can have better internet here. So in Costa Rica, as in many parts of the world, what has been happening is that the value of natural capital and ecosystem services has been ignored or underestimated in policy making when policymakers take decisions in cost-benefit analysis and other kinds of ways. It's almost invisible for them, and that's has been causing as we know, a degradation, etc., of different ecosystems and their services. So the overarching goal of these thesis is, well, how to address this knowledge gap and how to formulate the economic incentives in institutions that can address this lack of information and also more of making aware policymakers and the scientist community as well about the topic. What I did was that I figured out that it would be helpful if I start from a very broad topic and then going down in a more specific topics. And I did this on my research is under different multiple scales. From the first paper is gonna see what's the natural capital state of the art, what we know, what we don't know, and this is gonna be the framework for the whole thesis. And it was kind of like my literature review at the beginning, and we converted as an article, as a paper, which was published, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more of that in a minute. Then what's the economic valuation at a regional scale? From the regional scale going down to a national scale, and then to a more local scale, and finishing with what do we do with this economic valuation, and it's trying to put it in policy making and through new institutional arrangement and different incentives and financial mechanisms. So those exact different levels of scales of research are my questions. And the first one is, what is the current state of knowledge of natural capital? Then at the regional scale, what is the current? And also we were able to model what's the future economic value of ecosystem services in Latin America and the Caribbean. Then I was asking if I can do a study on the national scale, and I focused it on Ramsar wetlands. And the question here, what would be what is the economic value of Ramsar wetlands in Costa Rica at a national level, using value transfer in this case. Then on a national scale, on a local scale, what's the economic value of ecosystem services provided by mangroves in the Gulf of Nicoya? We have 2 gulfs in Costa Rica, and this one is kind of like the main one in terms of economic activity. And at the end, what's the institutional arrangements and financial mechanisms that can be created to complement or substitute the current scheme that we have here for ecosystem services. I put here some of the pictures that I took when I was doing the wetlands paper, and it's sort of as an illustration to show how people depend on health ecosystem services. So this was in one province called Guanacaste, and people depend on wetlands to put the cattle on the wetlands, so they can have an income from this activity. So the first one, I did it with Bob, and it was a general framework or an explanation description of natural capital and ecosystem services. What's the state of the art of this topic? And here, just went through a very quick historical review of the topic. And for example, natural capital, for my surprise, has been there for a whole 4 decades right now, from 1973, in a book called Small is Beautiful, a study of economics and if people matter. Then nature services, which is a synonym of ecosystem services, has been there for as well for more that I've been around, from 1977, and in this paper on how much are nature services worth. Ecosystem services from 1981 on this book by Ehrlich on extinction. And so this has been kind of like the cornerstones of the topic, the main basis, the knowledge that started the whole topic. And of course, there's the seminal book of Gretchen Daly in 1997, and as well as the paper of Bob and colleagues, which has been one of the most cited papers on the topic, and I think in many different topics. So that's kind of like the historical basis for the topic here. And then another key issue is to understand the type of resources that we're going to manage, and what type of resources have natural capital. What does it mean? And here it's important to have what are an excludable resource, what is a rival resources, and also how this relationship determines what we call the fund service resources and stock flow resources, which in the majority of times, fund service resources are services, and stock flow resources are goods. The majority of times, or most ecosystem services are non-excludable and also non-rival resources, and that's part of the problem or not the problem, but the challenge in managing them. The definition of natural capital, I'm going to go through these ones a little bit quicker so we can focus on the studies. Natural capital is the stock of natural resources, for example, the ecosystems that yield flow of goods and services. And that's why I like more when we speak about natural capital and not natural assets. When sometimes people refer as them as if they are synonyms, but I think a clear definition and a clear difference is that capital produces service, produces good and services, as in the case of natural capital and ecosystem services. And ecosystem services has been defined as the benefits that people get from or receive from health ecosystems, as it is in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, but also could be, as Bob has defined it in colleagues in many papers, refer to the relative contribution of natural capital to the production of various human benefits. And these, what is important here. Yeah.
Marcelo?
Yeah.
Can you speed it up a bit on this part? Because I think this is all really familiar to people. And
all right. So, yeah, you know that.
And then I'll let you have it, and you can be here all afternoon. So.
Cool. Yeah, sorry. So I'm gonna go through this real quick. You know all the types of ecosystem services. Um, so do you want me to skip this whole section?
Just sort of skip through it. I think
All right.
it's good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's, I just had here some slides on what's value and valuation, which is key for the next papers that I'm going to present. But yeah, most of you are very familiar with this, and some people has confused value with price, and that's not the case here. And I'm not gonna talk about this because we all know about that. A list of ecosystem services method valuations that I use in the other papers are cited here, as it is in Farber and also in another papers by Turner and Bob as well. Um, and these papers also present what could be the most appropriate methods to conduct an economic valuation. And many of these are the ones that I use for the papers that I'm going to present in a minute. So if you don't have time or budget to do this sort of primary analysis, benefit transfer is the option. And some may have been familiarized with benefit transfer is just taking values from other studies and applying to your study. And we did that on one case on the wetlands paper. As I was telling you, this little paper was published in the Rules Handbook of Agriculture Economics this year. So it was a good opportunity to have that chapter there. The first valuation paper that we did was the regional scale, which the future scenarios for the value of ecosystem services in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I did it with a focus on Costa Rica, and we did it with other colleagues that many are in the room. And this, as I was telling you, is part of the regional scale that we wanted to do some research on. And the reason why Latin America was kind of like an important case study was that, well, the region holds 60% of the global terrestrial biodiversity, as well as many marine and freshwater flora and fauna. 6 of the most biodiverse countries are in Latin America and the Caribbean. And also it's because it's a region very interesting because it is very diverse in terms of economy, geography, politics, etc. And well, it's worth noting that this paper was based on the paper that Aida and colleagues did back in 2017 on a global scale. So we were able to pull up Latin America and the Caribbean and do a more in-depth analysis of the region and also a more in-depth analysis of the country, in this case, Costa Rica. So the methods are pretty straightforward. In theory, we selected 4 different scenarios, and each one of them describes a plausible future under a different environmental and social economic situations. So we have the market forces, which is focused on the more market way of thinking. Fortress world, which is more fragmented, inequitable. It's more social, such as a social collapse scenario, and a policy reform, and then the utopia, which hopefully we can achieve someday, that is the great transition scenario. So just a quick picture of how each one of them would look like. That's the market forces, the policy reform, fortress world, which is kind of like the more chaotic one, the worst one out of all, and then the great transition. So how we assess the value of ecosystem services in the future was taking into consideration these 4 scenarios, and through these 4 scenarios, the value could change due to 2 factors. One is the change in the area covered by each ecosystem service, each ecosystem type, and also the change in unit value due to different good or bad practices, which could be degradation or restoration of the service. Each scenario was assigned, which is based on other studies for the one, for example, the one on Bateman for the UK on scenarios. Each one of them were assigned a reduction in the majority of times or an increase of area and value. Market forces was a 10% reduction in unit values from the base level, the baseline, which was 2011. Then we had the fortress world with a 20% decrease. The policy reform, it's almost insignificant, the change, although we saw some changes here. The great transition, which is a 20% increase in the unit values. Well, we used global land use data analysis layer with a resolution of 1 square kilometer for the 4 scenarios, a modified version of the GlobeCov data, and for each scenario, depending on the scenario, the land cover grew or shrank based on the percentages that I just showed you. So the results in terms of the unit values, you can see it here for every ecosystem and for each land use or ecosystem. So we have the area, the unit values for the present, and also for each one of these scenarios. And
hey Marcello, that's not quite right. So the values changed based on the 10-20%, but the land cover shrank or expanded based on another.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the area changed depending on the modeling that was done on GIS.
But the percentages of how much that land use changed were actually based on the Great Transition website and how much they predicted that each scenario that land use would change. And then wetlands we did based on how much things changed from Bob's wetland paper before. And so those were not correlated with the 10 and 20%.
Got it. Yeah, sorry.
Just to make that clear.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ida. So then we have all the different values for each one of the countries that we assessed, with was around was 33. That's kind of like the most official list of Latin American, Caribbean countries. We have Costa Rica, which I'm gonna talk a little bit more in depth afterwards. So this was kind of like the maps that we were able to do, although in the legend here it said coral reefs and the marine shelf in the open ocean. It wasn't, we weren't able to do marine ecosystems because different difficulties in modeling the change of those countries, because it's not as easy in terrestrial ecosystems where you can see very clear the limits of each land use in each country. So maybe it's going to be very subtle the change in the maps that I'm going to show you, but that's the base in 2011, and that's how it could change for market forces, and then fortress world, which is kind of like the worst case scenario. And here you could see, for example, in South America, where you have a big patch of what it used to be forest, and now it's desert, as well as how the urban areas increased, policy reform, and then the Great Transition. So at this scale, it's kind of difficult to see it here. Some of the results, well, the total terrestrial ecosystem services in 2011 was 15 trillion for the whole region. Brazil, as it was kind of obvious, was going to have the largest value because of its size and extensive forest cover. And if you are going to analyze this in more per hectare, in a per hectare perspective, then the Caribbean has one of the highest, which was very interesting to see. And in Mesoamerica, which is well, the rest that is not South America, Costa Rica had the highest value. On the future scenarios, the fortress world has a 47 decrease in the value. The market forces a 32 decrease. The policy reforms was very subtle, almost not changed, just a 1% increase. And the Great Transition, 25 increase. And the conclusions here as well, we just have estimate or scenarios. These are not predictions, but could help to inform decision makers. Right now, we develop policies under the assumption that nothing's going to change. So these could provide that information for policymakers, and also to engage the larger public in thinking about these kind of different futures. And one thing that is worth noting is that we don't took in consideration scarcity or change in incomes, because on an economic theory, if you have less of a resource, then that resource in theory would be more valuable. Well, that we didn't take it into account. Then on a more national scale, the economic value of wetlands in Costa Rica.
Marcelo,
Yes.
has that paper been submitted?
This one?
The last one, the second one.
No, the future scenarios has not been submitted.
Okay.
The wetlands one was submitted to Wetlands, the journal Wetlands. So
Marcelo, because there's a group of us on that first paper, it'd be really good if you at least sent it around to the co-authors before you even put it into your dissertation.
Before putting into the dissertation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Because you worked off of models and numbers that other people did. And from what you explained, you didn't quite explain it right. So I think before you publish it anywhere, including your dissertation, the other co-authors have to approve it.
Yeah. The majority, all the co-authors had the versions were.
No, that's not true, because I haven't seen anything for over a year on this paper.
All right. I'll send you the emails that I sent you guys, but that's not a problem. But yeah, thanks, Ida.
Yeah.
So, the economic values at a regional, well, no, not a regional, a national scales that we did was on wetlands. As I was saying, Costa Rica is part of the Ramsar Convention, which is the Wetlands Convention since 1991. We have 12 Ramsar sites, and here we picked 7 to do this study, which would be one of the most representatives in the country. The methods that we used was first, we had to determine the extension of each ecosystem. And for wetlands or for Ramsar wetlands, it's a challenge because there's not one category of land use. It's a bunch of different ecosystems that represent each Ramsar site. So a wetland site could be made of forests, agriculture fields, plus other types of wetlands like mangroves, etc. In total, we assessed 17 land use categories. We used benefit transfer, and we used around 300 estimates for the total of these 16 land use categories. Although the productive land uses, like the rice paddies or pineapple fields, or all of those, we did it through a market analysis. So those ones that we had information, we didn't do it through benefit transfer as for the ecosystems itself. These are the extensions that we were able to do it with the help of wetlands project from the United Nations that it was based here in Costa Rica for 3 years. So once we had every extension of every one of the land uses, we were able to see or to apply the values that we took from benefit transfer. These were the results that we got from those 300 or a little bit more of studies, where we estimated the minimum, the maximum, the average, and the median. And the median is very important because some of the values that we got were very low and some were very high. So in order to address that extreme, we also presented our results in using the median. When we apply these values to the extensions that I showed you, we got these results. The one, not these, sorry, the ones that I'm going to present next to these. Also, one important thing is that the values that we got from different studies were in different for different years, and also for different how to say, each one of them use different periods of time, and difference in the coin itself. I don't know how, the currency. So we had to apply the consumer price index to put everything in 2015 dollars. And also we applied the purchasing power parity to put it in international dollars. So everything is very well standardized. Then through market analysis, we were able to determine each income per hectare per year for the economic activities such as rice, banana, sugarcane, etc. And we took it from the literature and also from some interviews that we did with one of a few companies here in Costa Rica.
Hey Marcello, just a quick question. So for papers, you did benefit transfer. Out of the papers you took the values from, how many of those were benefit transfers and what methods did they use?
Well, it's beyond the scope in the presentation to tell you exactly which ones of them.
Yeah, I'm not asking for like specific, but have you looked at which of those that you used values from were already benefit transfers and what methods we didn't. Well, we excluded the ones that used probably benefit transfer, as well as those that were totals instead of per hectare basics. And we also did. We also selected only the studies that were similar to Costa Rica in terms of sort of the ecosystems that we were gonna take. The tropics. We focused on the tropics. And so, for example, if we were assessing forests, we were not gonna take into account temperate forests from the States or from Alaska or Canada, right? So those things were taken in consideration for this one. So none of the papers you used the values from had done benefit transfer originally?
No, those are based on primary studies.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
The paper has in one of the appendices that all explained, but sorry, I cannot No,
that's perfect. Thanks.
So rivers on a per hectare basis are the ones that are more valuable here, and these, and every one of them you can analyze them because difference in each one of the ecosystem services that they provide. Some are more valuable than others. So for example, in rivers, the ecosystem service of prevention of extreme events are quite valuable. And that's for every one of the ecosystems that we assess. So beaches are the second ones, and this because the high value in recreation and rainforest as well. So we applied it to all of the 12, no, to the 7 Ramsar wetlands that we assessed, and we got these results where North Caribbean was the highest one, and then we have Palo Verde, and then Mackenzie. And again, these vary depending on the type of ecosystem or land use, as well as the extension of the that land use itself. And at the end, if you take in consideration only the mean value, the average value, we estimated in almost $3.3 billion, which is a high percentage of, a good percentage of the gross domestic product here in Costa Rica.
Marcelo, just one quick point about presentation. You shouldn't show all these decimal points or decimal places.
Sorry?
You should not, on tables like this, you're showing too many decimal places.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Makes 45 cents at the end of the
Yeah.
And estimating, you should probably state them, drop off the everything.
Yeah, totally.
These millions or, okay.
Okay, thanks. So this was one of the first economic valuation or the first economic valuation that we did on Ramsar wetlands in Costa Rica. That was a gap of knowledge that was here. And it contributes to other policies that the government just launched, for example, the policy on wetlands. And this policy states the need to do economic valuation on natural capital. So these results go straight to help to fulfill these policies. And the results also help to develop new financial mechanisms on wetlands conservation as well as other ecosystems, because now we have values on a per hectare basis that perhaps we didn't have, or not perhaps, we didn't have them before these results. And this was published as a report, but now it's been hopefully published on wetlands, which is in the last stages of the process. One of the newest one was the economic valuation of ecosystem services provided by mangrove forest here in Costa Rica, in the Gulf of Nicoya. And we did, yeah.
So what's the status of the Ramsar paper again? That's been submitted, or?
Yeah, the wetlands one right now it's under review. So the editor already kind of like, it passed that filter, and now they were assigned the reviewers. So it's in that.
Where was it submitted?
Wetlands.
The previous one, the Ramsar one.
Wetlands.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So this one, which is the fourth one on a more local scale, we did it with Bob and Miguel Cifuentes, and each one of them brought like a specific knowledge, and we chose Miguel because he's an expert on blue carbon, and we assess blue carbon, so that was his contribution. A little bit of background: Costa Rica has been losing mangroves on a rate of 1.3% per year. It has been slowing down a little bit, but we lost 43% of our mangroves, and this has been from the last 30 years. And one of the reasons is because mangroves are seen as ecosystem that doesn't have any value. And the majority of evaluation studies has been done in Asia and Africa, and Central America and South America only has 6% of the studies. So it's been a knowledge gap for the whole region here in Central America, and especially in Costa Rica. The methods, again, since we did a hybrid approach, we used primary and secondary information. We started with benefit transfer, but then we moved to an expert modified benefit transfer. So the benefit transfer was like a first approximation to the value, and then we did some workshops with experts from the country in which they were from the academy, the government, etc., and they help us define the areas where ecosystem services were provided and sort of in what quantities. Because when you apply benefit transfer, what you're applying, you are assuming that the whole area provides the service, because you're not taking into account the beneficiaries from that service. With the expert modified transfer, we tried to take into consideration that not only what are the potential areas or the whole potential area that can provide the services, but what are actually the areas that are supplying the service. And then we did a series of primary studies for 3 ecosystem services, for climate regulation, for food, and for coastal protection. For climate regulation, we assessed carbon stocks and also carbon sequestration. Because we're interested in the change of ecosystem services. We assess carbon stocks, but at the end, we didn't take it in account carbon stocks, and we only took into account carbon sequestration. Carbon stocks were assessed through what we call the marginal abatement cost, which is kind of like the opportunity cost. And the carbon sequestration, we use the social cost of carbon. Many papers has valued carbon sequestration using market prices. How much worth is one ton of carbon in the market? But it's more accurate to assess the impact that each ton of carbon has on society in terms of health, infrastructure, etc., etc. So we chose this one. For fisheries, we did a more market price, of course, and combined with production. And also the coastal protection, we did a combination of benefit transfer to estimate the value per hectare, but we did some modeling using INVEST. INVEST has a model on coastal vulnerability. So we use it to determine which areas are more vulnerable, and therefore where the mangroves were providing the service in the highest or with the highest intensity. The results, and here I didn't put the decimals. These was the first results that we had, where we estimated the minimum, again, the maximum, the mean value, and median value for each one of the services, on a total of 11 services, ecosystem services for mangroves. So we were able to do it for the entire Gulf of Nicoya, but also since we had the total extension of mangroves in Costa Rica, we estimated as a first approximation how much mangroves are worth in the country for these 11 ecosystem services. The service that has the highest value was timber and fieldwood, and this is interesting, and it was part of what we corrected on the benefit, the expert modified transfer. It's illegal to take timber or fieldwood for mangroves in Costa Rica. So this is part of the analysis that we did afterwards. Then biodiversity protection and coastal protection, those were kind of like the highest mean values. But if you see it through or using the median values, it changes. And coastal valuation was the highest one, then timber and food, and then timber and fieldwood, and then food for fisheries. And in the last place, climate regulation. So the mean value for the Gulf of Nicoya, it's around $811 million, with a median value of $88 million. And for the national assessment was around $1.5 billion, or in a median value of almost $160 million. This is sort of the analysis that we did for the expert modified benefit transfer. I don't want to present all the maps that we did, but we identified the areas where the services was provided the most. So here is the example of firewood and timber, or also fodder for cattle, which is more in the margins of the mangrove. So we were able to correct the first estimates using benefit transfer with this expert modified transfer. In blue are the services that the expert modified, and then we had a new estimates for the Gulf of Nicoya. So this was kind of like the second filter, or the second tier approach to have a more accurate value of the estimates. And here biodiversity protection was one of the highest ones, or the highest one, then coastal protection and fuel and timber, fieldwood and timber. If you're using the median value, if we see the median value, then coastal protection was the highest one, then fisheries, and then climate regulation. And these exact three services, the ones that I'm showing with the median value, was the one that we used to conduct primary studies. So for the carbon stocks, we were able to divide the Gulf of Nicoya depending on where service was provided in the most intensity. And in the upper part of the Gulf, carbon stocks are the lowest, and in the lower part is where carbon stocks are the highest. And this is probably because salinity and the bathymetry, etc., of the Gulf. So we divided by zones, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, depending on the ecosystem, on the ecosystem services, the carbon stock here. So we have in tons of carbon for per hectare. So zone 1 is the one that has the lowest per hectare values, and zone 3 the highest ones. And the reason that we did this sort of analysis is because it would have been easier to have an average, just to have an average, say, between 400 and 1,500, but instead we divided by area, by zone, and then multiplied it by the MAC, or the marginal abatement cost, and then we were able to have the total value for the ecosystem service. And for carbon sequestration was kind of like straightforward. We took a sequestration rate from the literature, and which was 6 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. And then the price of, the value of the social carbon, which is 87, but we had to convert it, the carbon into carbon dioxide, so that's why it says 319. And the total area of the Gulf of Nicoya was around almost 20,000 hectares. So that we ended up having a total value of 38 million for carbon sequestration. For the fisheries, it was a long process, but we ended up being able to define how much each species is valued. And the corvinas are the ones that are the most valuable, but also white shrimp. And that's because of his, they have a really high value per kilogram. And also what we call here piangua, which is kind of like, it's a type of bivalve that you can catch in the mangrove forest. And for bivalves, since they don't move, or at least not significantly, we were able to map where those that service was being provided, and also classified it by species. The coastal protection results. So we produced a set of 9 maps applying INVEST and the recollection of information was long, because we have to have different information such as sea level rise, bathymetry, topography, population, etc. So one of the main results was the map that has the red line, and the one in the upper part, and that says where the provision of the mangroves, the provision of coastal protection, is the highest. So we were able, using that map that we produced through modeling, to produce or to classify each area of mangroves depending on that. So we classified it in high, medium, or low coastal protection, and then we assigned it a weight depending on the level of protection, and then we were able to multiply the values for the values per hectare for the weight, and then for the whole extension. And so we were able to have one of the first comparisons between methods. So we have all the values that we got from benefit transfer, all the values that we have from expert modified transfer, and also combining expert modified transfer plus primary studies. And it shows how it can differ if you use average values. For example, the one that we have on 800 millions as an average value using benefit transfer, and then the mean value combining modified transfer and primary studies. But if you analyze a median value, it's very similar between these two, which tells that if you conduct very well the benefit transfer, you can have reliable results. Climate regulation and coastal protection, it's 91% of the total value of ecosystem services. And if we take in consideration fisheries, this represents 5%. So we were able to estimate 96% of the total value of ecosystem services in the Gulf using primary studies. The total median value is 0.16% of the GDP in Costa Rica, which is exactly the national budget of the Ministry of Environment. I'm going to go through the policy implications really quick because I want to present the last one. I know I don't have much time right now. But the policy implications is that we can build, or we can use it to build the first coastal marine accounts. Costa Rica is now building different environmental accounts under the central bank. So with these values, we can build the first marine and coastal account. It supports the wetlands policy. It supports a new blue carbon strategy that the Costa Rica, the government is working on, and it needs the values of the ecosystem services related to carbon. And also, these values are used to a new PES scheme, which is the one that I'm going to propose at the end, on a PES scheme focused on coastal and marine ecosystems. So in conclusion, it's the first of its kind comparing results of economic valuations using this hybrid 3-tier method. It supports a properly conducted benefit transfer, and that I know, and I couldn't find any in the literature. It was the first hybrid integration between invest and benefit transfer. And the last one, it's exactly the last point that I was saying on the policy implications, is more a research and policy agenda for creating a PES scheme, a payment for ecosystem service scheme on coastal and marine ecosystem service in Costa Rica. This was my last question of the research. And well, Costa Rica has been a leader in payment for ecosystem services schemes. More than a green country, I think we're a blue country. We have 10 times marine area than what we have in terrestrial area. And well, the new coastal marine program can learn from the forest program that we have that has some deficiencies. the main difference here is that the forest payment for ecosystem services that we have is that the buyer, it's one only buyer, which is the government, and the seller are the private landowners. And with under the blue fund, what I call the blue fund, which is this proposal of new pest scheme, we would have many buyers, many sectors, and only one seller, because under Costa Rican legislation, all coastal marine ecosystems are owned by the government. So the research agenda is that started with an ecosystem assessment, the extension, the health, then an ecosystem services selection and evaluation. You identify the threats and also prioritize them, then design the institutional arrangement and the financial mechanism that are going to address those threats directly. And that's part of the key principle of pest schemes, which is additionality. And then the implementation of the solutions that you can fund through the different funding sources that the institutional arrangement can create in the financial mechanism. And at the end, also a key principle is conditionality. So you keep paying depending on if the service is being provided, and this is through evaluation and adaptation. So I applied to coral reefs and mangroves, and I selected for each one of them 3 ecosystem services that I present here, and each one of them has their beneficiaries. I did a threat identification for each one of them, and then analyze which were the main polluters for each ecosystem each ecosystem, and also which were the main beneficiaries for each ecosystem. So we can determine who to pay, how much to pay, and also what problems address. And in principle, you can start with more straightforward initiatives such as a plastic tax or a carbon tax, and that's part of the side of the polluters. But from the side of the buyers, the beneficiaries, a diving fee for coral reefs or private public funding for both ecosystems, and also carbon credits would be the first credits based on blue carbon from mangroves. So the ones on the left are more mandatory under the polluters pay principle, and on the right more voluntary. And then you can fund with these different initiatives, such as restoration, sustainable agriculture, and all of these has a relationship with the threats identified first. Final remarks is that this research were able to close the gap on ecosystem service evaluation in the country and in the region. We didn't used to have many, or almost, just a few case studies, and now we have 3 or 4. Set the scientific basis for a new financial incentive, such as the one that I just presented, and also we were able to do a comparison between methodologies for future studies that weren't available before. And also, which I think is kind of important and very important, is that we were able to do capacity, or I was able to do capacity building through some of the studies, interacting with local people and the government and other colleagues. And just a quick acknowledgements to, of course, my family, my panel of supervisors, which almost all are here, and friends and colleagues that helped me a lot, all the co-authors, especially, almost all the papers has co-authors, and the Ministry of Science and Technology for the scholarship that gave me for this research. And of course, Crawford, which has been an amazing experience to be at Crawford, at least for some periods of time in Australia. So that's all, pura vida, and the rest would be for questions. I'm gonna switch to video. Thank you.
So you want to go ahead and ask questions first?
Yeah, well, I mean, change thanks, Machar. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, a little bit in the far, but yeah.
I can't get close. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Closer, closer to here.
Yeah.
That's all right.
So I just had one question. With the mangroves, where you had all your ecosystem services listed, I noticed that you had supporting services and with the value against those. Technically speaking, if they're supporting services, their value should be incorporated in the value of the other services. So I imagine, well, my question, I guess, is how...
Sorry, Steve, I can't hear you quite well. Can you go closer to the computer? Sorry for that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, much better.
Good, right. Yeah, look, I was just asking about the supporting services in the mangrove table.
Yeah.
If they are truly supporting services, then I would think their value would be counted in the value of the services that they're supporting. So my question is how you avoided double counting. I think I know what you've done. You've valued ecosystem services independently, but if that's the case, you probably shouldn't call them supporting services.
Yeah, we actually had that issue, especially for fisheries, because that line can be really thin in defining, okay, which are the supporting services that are providing those fish that are going to get caught, and then we're going to value through market prices. So that's why we try not to include as much as other studies include other supporting services. And what we also saw is that many studies, what would do was to include the supporting services under other services, such as regulating services. But since we started with some lists from the TEED study in the TEED database, and they declassify those supporting services. That's why it's showing up, especially in the value transfer part. But you're totally right, and I think that's why we didn't include more, because of being afraid of those of that double counting.
Thanks, Macha.
Thank you. I think Allman has a question here.
Okay. You lost your video on Charlie. What happened to you?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Should I go? Okay. Well, first of all, hello to the rest of the people that I didn't say hi before. Ida, it's nice to hear your voice at least. I cannot see you, but it's good. And everybody. I have a question that I can divide in two parts, specifically to the paper related to Latin America. From the economic point of view, this is the reasoning or the explanation that the Caribbean has the highest per hectare value of ecosystem services, especially considering that it's larger than Brazil, where the Amazon, or larger than Costa Rica, that is very diverse biodiversity. And the second part of the question is thinking about policy making. In general, these studies are very valuable for policy making, but politicians and people in general do not understand very much all the economic logic. Then let's suppose that your grandma, Marcelo, is going to ask you the same question: why the biodiversity of the Caribbean is more valuable than the one from Brazil or from Costa Rica, according to your study? But of course, you know that your grandmother cannot understand all the economic reasoning that you are going to do. How do you explain one and the other one.
Okay, thanks. So let me see if I got it right. In that study from Latin America, the Caribbean, and specifically in the Caribbean, it was Bahamas, the one that had the greatest value, the highest value. And that's because, yeah, it's true. If you compare it to Brazil, Brazil is huge, has this huge rainforest. But when you do it per hectare and you have all of those values and divided up or divided by the total extension, it depends on the value of each ecosystem services or each land use in this case. The Caribbean, and specific the Bahamas, has the particularity that a high percentage of its territory, it was mangroves. And mangroves are one of the highest valued land uses. So if you have a very high land use a very high, a land use that is very valuable, when you divide it by the total extension, then you have a higher number than other ecosystems such as Brazil, where the percentage of higher valuable land uses such as mangroves is not as high as in the Bahamas. So yeah, I think if I would have to explain that to my grandma, who's there, it would be, well, grandma, if we are, I don't know, if in Cuba, we depend on mangroves, and we have a small territory, and a big part of that territory it's mangroves, and we depend the majority of those. And that's why we're gonna have the greatest benefits from that ecosystem.
Okay.
Okay, I don't know if you want to participate on that.
There's someone else that has a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, one more question. Actually, 1.5 from you, Marcel. 2 parts to it. As you know, we're doing a lot of work with Mauritius on sustainability at the moment. And I was just wondering what your sense was. So firstly, congratulations. It's a great piece of work. And I think there'd be a lot of interest in taking what you've done, particularly in Costa Rica, and transferring it as a best practice to other countries. So I'll be in Mauritius next week, and we'll be talking to a lot of senior government people, including probably the Prime Minister, and they'd be very interested in replicating something like this over there. How transferable do you think the work you have done is to, another country, and particularly something like a place like Mauritius, which again is a smaller country, it's manageable, there's a lot of political involvement in the overall running of the day-to-day parts of the country, the economics. And they're concerned about the whole ecological systems as well, because they support tourism, they support a lot of the development. That's part one. The second half is perhaps a harder one, which is obviously in talking to politicians, then all of this sort of stuff needs to translate into their language. Now, the fact that it translates into dollars is really important. Linking that into the larger economic modelling in the country is a way of really getting their attention. And I was wondering if you'd looked at that at all, getting a link with the Department of Economics or Treasury into what you're doing as a reflection of the larger economic model. So 2 tricky questions, but appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Nice to see you, by the way. So the first one, depending on if you want to transfer, if you want to use, for example, a method like benefit transfer to use our values in Costa Rica and apply it to Mauritius, the ones that would be transferable would be the ones that we did on primary studies, for example, the ones on climate regulation and food. But you would have also to assess how is the country composed, what are the mainland uses, so what would be the key priority ecosystem and ecosystem services to value. perhaps, I don't know if it has a big extension of mangroves that you can take from our study on mangroves and apply it there. I know Mauritius may have a lot of coral reefs, for example, that we haven't done any primary studies here in Costa Rica. The next step for next year, that's what I would like to do, coral reefs. So first you would need to assess how is the country composed and what would be the ecosystems that are the most interest for the authorities or for you as a researcher, and then see if you can take from our primary studies, but only from our primary studies, the ones that we did on mangroves. And then the second one, I've been in touch with the Minister of Environment and also with the person that is leading the green accounts or the environmental accounts at the central bank. And they are quite interested, for example, in establishing a new coastal or marine coastal account where you can keep track of how much the country is gaining or losing in these ecosystems. And of course, we already have mangroves, and now I'm proposing to do the same thing for coral reefs. So if we can have both ecosystems, we can put it as part of the environmental accountability of the country. And for policies, we're developing, well, the country is developing different policies, such as the blue carbon strategy. And since we determined that 91% of the mangroves, the value of the mangroves, is due to climate change related ecosystem services, these values can be used in that blue carbon strategy straight away. It would be very valuable.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
I think we've lost the audience. Well, after everyone's gone, a couple of comments and going forward. So on all of your tables, I think you've got too many significant figures. I wouldn't have more than like 4 or 5 significant figures on. Because not just investment funds, but you know what I mean? But you have something where the tables are all in millions of dollars, not outside of thousands or millions. You know what I mean?
No, sorry, I didn't. You're too far. I thought that you were talking to someone else.
No.
Sorry.
So in all of your tables, you have too many significant figures.
Okay.
Cut that down so it looks funny.
Okay, like divided by 1,000 or even by
thousands or millions or something. So you only have like a maximum of maybe 4 or 5 digits.
Yeah. Okay.
The rest are not really significant anyway.
Yeah, because right now it's too crowded, probably. Yeah. I totally agree. Thanks.
Good. And where were you thinking of submitting the Gulf of Nicoya?
Which one?
The Gulf of Nicoya, the paper number 4.
So that one is submitted on ecosystem services.
Okay.
And I know it's already under review. So they already assigned reviewers and it's under review right now.
Okay, so that's submitted. And the 5th one, how are you doing on that?
The 5th one, it's practically done. So I'm just gonna do some final things before submitting. And this one could be, I gotta choose the journal, but I've seen that the majority of these kind of papers goes to marine policy, could be ecological economics or ecosystem services as well. So any of those 3.
Okay. Rather that should be done soon. But I mean, what came across there to me was you really are talking about a blue fund, rather than a payment ecosystem services idea. But you're saying the government owns all of the marine territory.
Bob, can you get a little bit closer, please?
Yeah. I'm gonna.
Yeah. Perfect. Too close.
So it's And I'm not sure how you were talking about it. I mean, initially you were talking about, a payment for ecosystem services for marine and coastal systems. But I think what you're really talking about there is a blue fund, a common asset fund, trust fund, something like that. You want the private parties to contribute to this fund, and then the government would use that to pay other private parties to do certain things. Is that right?
Yeah, I think could be a combination, because it's still a payment, because it's the other way around. Now beneficiaries, like tourists, pay the government for the provision of that service of having healthy coral reefs. And those funds that the government gets are applied for coral reefs conservation, for example. So that's why it was very important to determine both the polluters, the beneficiaries, what are the threats, to connect everything. And the ones that are more mandatory, like the taxes, the plastic and the carbon taxes, like the one that we already have for FONAFIFO, the forest fund, that the majority of the funding comes from 3.5 tax on fossil fuels.
Right.
And that.
No, I think in both cases they're better described as funds rather than payments that you're paying directly. Anyway.
Yeah,
just,
yeah. It's not under a market approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think just to be clear about that.
Yeah. Thanks.
What else? Okay. And I guess I just comment, just make sure you send the second paper, about the future scenarios. That gets sent around to all the co-authors before you send it in. Where were we going to send that one, by the way?
Well, the last time that we discussed it, we were trying to figure it out like a more Latin American journal. So I'm looking for like a high quality journal, but from the region that would be more interested in that, instead of a more kind of like,
right.
Instead of ecosystem services or some of that type.
Right. Okay. That would be good, because the one that we did like that for Asia, got sent to the Asia and Pacific Policy Studies Journal.
Yeah.
So if there's something kind of equivalent for Latin American policy studies, or All right.
And
that one's, is that ready to send?
Well, the last time that I sent it to everybody, Charlene and Paul was like agreed with the format. I think Ida didn't say anything, and then you had some comments, and I worked on that comment, so it's more on your side, because we wanted to go a little bit further than the one for Asia. I was trying to do a more in-depth analysis of the region that wasn't done by the Asian.
Right. So is it ready to send then, you think?
Almost, yeah.
Okay. I think Ida's point was just, before you send it, or maybe at the same time, just send it around to all the co-authors. So
definitely. Yeah, no, definitely. No, before I send it, I'll send it to you guys.
Yeah, okay, that was it. Okay, anything else?
Not from me. I don't know if there's somebody else in the room.
I would like to say something.
They're all gone. I said 40 minutes.
Well, I went really quick. It's a lot of things. It was an hour and 5 minutes.
Which is more than 40 minutes.
But with questions.
Yeah. So, is Olman still there?
Yeah.
Yes, I am here.
Okay.
I actually,
Olman,